You talked about the fact that you had been having trouble, that you were consumed by these images, and that it gave you some hope to see that there were people in positions of some privilege or potential privilege on college campuses who were also responding to them. And yet, obviously, many people, maybe most people, don't really particularly. And I'm just curious if you thought a little bit about why it is that you couldn't get these images out of your head, how much of it is just because of the accident of the fact that you come from the Arab world, and why you think it is that these college students, some of them, weren't able to get these things out of their head when obviously so many people are able to get them out of their head, including perhaps the people who are actually sending the weapons to begin with.
It's a good question. And I think it's a difficult one because, or at least I don't know that I have a good answer for you because the starting point is a kind of irreversible change on my part that I genuinely don't know how to go about explaining. I think everybody has moments in their lives where they can say, I was one kind of person on one side of this and I'm another person on the other side of it. And for me, most recently, it was the audio of Hind Rajab begging for her life before the soldiers shot the car she was in at least 355 times. And I don't, I'm not going around trying to convince anybody to feel the same way I did on the other side. It doesn't matter to me. All I know is that I'm a different human being on the other side of that. And maybe it's she's Arab and I'm Arab. I don't know. I don't want to know. I don't want to test that theory. I did. The book came out in the UK and Ireland before it came out in North America. So that was the first leg of the book tour. And that was really nice because no matter how much I screwed up all my media interviews, I could then leave and sort of leave the mess for my British publisher to deal with. But it was, so my first interviews happened in the UK, and one of the earliest ones ended up being with this reporter who was a very hardcore Zionist. And so, it was a deeply unpleasant 45 minutes, but we're human beings. And I have this very naive belief that whatever our opinions, I'll find something. I'll find some form of human connection if it's the two of us sitting in a room. And so we're talking, and it occurs to me after a while that so many of the questions seem to boil down to this notion of, oh, you don't want these people to be slaughtered? Well, who do you want to be slaughtered then? Like this idea that this is a binary, you're either stepping on the neck or you're having your neck stepped on. And if you believe in that kind of worldview, again, A, I'm not going to convince you otherwise, but B, a lot of this makes sense then, right? I don't know. Not only can I not answer the question, and this is more troubling for me, is that I can't answer the inverse question either, which is why is it that so many people can see these images and shrug them off? That to me is just as baffling. I can't explain that, the other day or last week, I can't even tell anymore. I saw an image of a girl split in half, a baby girl split in half in the rubble, and her sibling crying out. Is it because they're Arab and I'm Arab that I'm having this reaction? If that was an Israeli kid split in half, would I not have that reaction? And if so, is that not just the plainest admission of monstrousness? I honestly, I can't pontificate on it. I can only tell you that there is nothing that can be said about me. There is no allegation. There is no amount of antagonism that is going to get me to become the kind of human being to shrug this stuff off. You hate Israel, you hate Jews, you love Hamas, you like all of that stuff. And I'm a guy who loves to be liked and is deeply insecure and, all of that good stuff. And in this situation, it doesn't matter to me in the slightest. I can't live with being the kind of human being who looks at something like this by the tens of thousands and then says, well, there's probably a good reason, or this needs to happen, or, well, time to move on. I just can't.
Yeah. One of the things in the book that struck me was this paragraph that I wanted to read and just ask you a little bit about. You write on page 17, one of the hallmarks of Western liberalism is an assumption, in hindsight, of virtuous resistance as the only polite expectation of people on the receiving end of colonialism. While the terrible thing is happening, while the land is still being stolen and the natives still being killed, any form of opposition is terroristic and must be crushed for the sake of civilization. But decades later, centuries later, when enough of the land has been stolen and enough of the natives killed, it is safe enough to venerate resistance in hindsight. I tell stories for a living, and there's a thick thread of narrative by well-meaning white Westerners that exalts the native populations in so many parts of the world for standing up to the occupiers, makes of their narrative a neat reflexive arc in which it was always understood by the colonized, and this part implied, the descendants of the colonizer, that what happened was wrong. It reminds me of a conversation that I had with Norman Finkelstein, where when he was trying to understand how to respond to October 7th, he went to read what white abolitionists had said about the Nat Turner Rebellion and then found that they hadn't really condemned it. And so he didn't really want to condemn it. And I suppose today there might be many people who would have trouble condemning the Nat Turner Rebellion. But yet I have to say, and maybe it is because I'm a prisoner of this moment, or maybe it's because I'm a Jew and because I have a particular connection, feel a particular connection to the Jewish Israelis who were killed on October 7th. It's hard for me, or I don't want to imagine a future necessarily in which people justify what Hamas did on October 7th, even if I do want people in the future and today to contextualize it and to understand that it didn't come from nowhere, that it came from a context of profound oppression. But I don't want that to overshadow the feeling that I feel like the people who killed civilians on October 7th still had a choice about what kind of resistance they practiced. So I wanted to ask you about that phrase within that particular context of the way you think we should think about October 7th now, and then the way you think it might be thought about by performative liberals in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think as in almost every historical case, those are two very, very different ways of
Mhm,
thinking about it, right? I mean, the
mhm,
privilege of not having to be in the moment of the
mhm,
atrocity is an immense one. I think precisely because it affords a kind of narrative freedom, either to address the thing as it is
mhm,
or to do the exact opposite.
mhm,
I was thinking about this, and Ta-Nehisi Coates puts out this book, and then he comes to the Northwest for 2 visits. He does an event in Portland, an event in Seattle, and I'm asked to moderate both of them, so I get a chance to talk to him. And we're talking a little bit about this idea of something like the Nat Turner Rebellion,
mhm,
that difference between contextualizing
mhm,
and allegiance,
mhm,
I think, becomes over time a much less fraught thing. When I read history books, the last thing I'm concerned with is whether the historian is aligned with the thing they're describing.
mhm,
And again, this goes back to the idea of the difference between the moment and the passage of time.
mhm,
I think the difficulty for me, or one of the many difficulties for me in writing this book, was this notion of having to address precisely the sort of thing you're talking about and the privilege of being able to pontificate about it
mhm,
while I'm sitting on the launching side of the bombs.
mhm, mhm,
Because I can sit here and I can tell you that I'm a pacifist
mhm,
and that I abhor all violence. And I believe this, and I have the privilege of believing this.
mhm,
But that doesn't change the fact that A, I get to believe this from a great distance. B, I am, by virtue of how my tax dollars are spent, one of the most violent human beings on earth.
mhm,
And C, I don't know that there's a single thing that I believe, no matter how strongly I believe it,
mhm,
that couldn't change in an instant if it's my kid torn to shreds.
mhm,
You ask about this idea of how something like an act of mass murder
mhm,
is going to be remembered in the future.
mhm,
I think there's a strong possibility that we're going to do with it what we do with a lot of cases in this kind of situation, which is just try to forget about it as much as possible.
mhm,
But this notion of contextualizing violence being equatable to aligning yourself with it, I think strikes me as patently absurd.
mhm,
And again, I think goes back to this idea of this underlying assumption, and I'm not saying that you're making it, but I've certainly seen it,
mhm,
that if it's Israelis or if it's Jews, then it's okay if their kids get killed, right? Because they're not mine. They're not my people. They're not like,
mhm,
and
mhm,
this just, I come to such a hard stop at that.
mhm, mhm,
This all ends, every piece of violence
mhm,
ends when an occupation ends,
mhm,
when a people don't have to live in an open air prison,
mhm,
when they're not subjected to constant degradation and humiliation and having to drive on different roads and take different buses and being told that sometimes cardamom is a security threat and can't be brought in. Cinnamon's fine. Because it really comes down to this notion of what you believe about the people that this is happening to. If you believe that they're inherently savage and that they're inherently prone to this kind of violence, then this all makes sense, right? They need to be eradicated. They need to be wiped out. There's no other solution because they're just inherently bloodthirsty. If you don't believe that, then you have to look at the conditions in which these human beings live and try to address the notion of what you would do if your life was spent from one bookend to the other inside a giant open-air prison in which every facet of your life was confined to and controlled by an occupation force. There is nothing that I would like to see more than the end of Hamas, because it would imply that the sort of occupation and the sort of conditions that led to the creation of a group like Hamas had come to an end as well. Now, if you hear that and you think that the natural implication is that I'm pro-Hamas and that I'm pro-violence against Israelis or against Jews, there's nothing I'm going to do to convince you otherwise. But I also can't live in this world where the terrible thing happens in a vacuum and then we all move on to the next terrible thing and we exist in these silos of atrocity, because the only sort of fathomable future in that kind of world is just continuous silos of atrocity. And I don't want to live in that kind of world.
This has been a free preview of my weekly conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest and support my work, please consider subscribing at peterbeinart.substack.com.